I'd like to begin by thanking. I'd like to begin by thanking the Vice Rector Dan David, the Department Head Oana Banga, the organizing committee, and of course the OPRI for putting together an extremely interesting conference and treating all of us so well. I'm going to talk about memory as a social organism. Anyone who has looked at the memory or thought about memory realizes the dominant view, at least among lay people, is that memory is a storehouse. And since Plato, scholars have likened memory to a storehouse, actually. Their notion is that experiences and traces of experiences are stored away and then at some appropriate moment brought into the footlights of consciousness. And Roddy Roddiger, quite a few years ago, made a list of sort of metaphors that people use about memory, and storehouse metaphors were very common. There people say house, purse, tape recorder, mystic writing pads, computers are the dominant one now, where we talk about encoding, storage, and retrieval. And to show its pervasiveness, there was a program on BBC the other day in which a neurosurgeon was interviewing the Norwegian novelist Carl Kierkegaard, and the neurosurgeon said, well, we all know that memory is like a tape recorder. That was a direct quote. So it's still quite pervasive, at least among neurosurgeons. But starting from Bartlett, if not before, and now I think in psychology, certainly if we listen to how everyone talked in the last few days, most people, at least psychologists, believe that memory doesn't work this way, and the computer analogy suggests that memory should be, whereas the computer analogy suggests that memory should be largely accurate, we know that memory is replete with distortions. You remember that Jane, for instance, had a yellow dress on, though in fact it was a blue dress, and also forgetting. You simply forget the color of Jane's dress. So we know at this point that memory is unreliable, and we also know that memory is malleable. External influences, such as what others say, will affect memory. They can reinforce, those external influences can reinforce some memories, they can implant new memories, and then by leaving some information unmentioned, they can promote forgetting. The question I want to sort of entertain is, do we think of this unreliability and malleability of memory as weaknesses of memory? And Dan talked about this a little bit when he talked about sins of memory, and then he quickly stepped back and said maybe some sins are virtues, and that there is actually an adaptive aspect. But you have to wonder that if memory is unreliable and malleable and not like a computer, why has Mother Nature somehow made such a flawed organism? Why are we affected by external influences? And so one of the points that Dan points out in one of his articles is, for instance, gist memory, which you could view as a flaw of memory, nevertheless supports the retention of themes and meaning, and these facilitate generalization and abstractions, all of which we would think are good things. But I want to take a particular social perspective on this and argue that one possible adaptation that has not been as underscored as much as I think it should be is the social value of memory's unreliability and malleability. And in order to do this, I want to concentrate on two different aspects of memory. The first is that, to a large extent, at least in humans, remembering is communicating. People often communicate with each other about the past. We constantly are talking to each other about the past. So Manisha Pashupati, for instance, pointed out that 62% of the events recorded by participants in a diary study were told to someone else by the end of the day. In one study, they took students from an introduction to psychology class to a morgue, and then they traced through how many people, just 3 exchanges, and after 3 exchanges in which a friend tells a friend and another friend tells another friend, 3 exchanges, 881 people knew about the trip to the morgue. So the information spread quite quickly. And Dan Wright has noticed that 58% of the eyewitnesses report discussing the incident with a co-witness, I believe within a day. Now, even when remembering alone, you could say that remembering is communicating. At least for me, when I try to remember as go through the day, as I'm trying to fall asleep, I'm talking to an audience. The audience may just be myself, but I'm nevertheless having a conversation with some virtual person, if you like. And we see this kind of communication occurring all the time. Families get together and they talk about past holidays. In my family, the only thing we have to talk about is past holidays because we have nothing else in common. Couples talk about how they first met. Constantly they were reminiscing about their past. And at least in the faculty meetings I attend to, we spend a lot of time trying to remember what we talked about in previous faculty meetings. Now, one of the things that is, I think, particularly true, you could say, well, other species communicate. Bees wag their tail on that thumb. I don't really think it's communication, but if you want to say it's communication, I guess you could. But one of the things I think is uniquely human is that we talk about things that we already know about. We talk about shared past. When we reminisce about a shared past. And I don't think bees sit there and talk about, oh my God, do you remember that honey that we had last night? I don't think that's how bees go. But we do this constantly. We constantly are talking about the shared past. So the first thing I want to point out when I think about memory and its social value is that memory is often, the act of remembering is often an act of communicating. The second thing is that one of the things, because memory occurs within acts of communication, it can promote the formation of a collective memory. And by a collective memory, I mean individual memories shared within a community that bear on the community's identity. And so it's sort of a collective version of an autobiographical memory, if you like, and there's been a lot of discussion in this conference about autobiographical memories. This is sort of the collective version of it. And to a large extent, collective memories arise because of societal effort. And since Maurice Halbwachs, who was a student of Durkheim's, there's been an extensive amount of work, a veritable industry on collective memory. But most of it's done from a more social science perspective than a psychological perspective. So there's a great deal of interest in societal efforts. And in particular, for instance, in memorials. I'm sorry these are American examples, but there you go. So that's the Lincoln Memorial. It's in Washington, D.C. If you go to Washington and you're a tourist, you go see the Lincoln Memorial. And as you can see, in the United States, there's two pervasive views about Lincoln. One is he's this common man who was born in a log cabin, had to study by the fireside because they couldn't afford candles, and he grew up to become president of the United States. The other is that he saved the country from being split apart during the Civil War, so he's this godlike figure. It's clear that the Lincoln Memorial is promoting a memory that treats Lincoln as a godlike figure. The Lincoln Memorial is based on a Greek temple. When you climb up the stairs, they're extremely steep, as if you're climbing up the Mount Olympus. And in there is Lincoln leaning over you, and this actual statue was modeled after a statue of Zeus. The other memorial that I put up here is a memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, a very different one. It's non-representational. I could talk about it for a while. I won't talk about it for a while. But a lot of people, because it has all the names of the people that were killed during the war, the Americans, not the Vietnamese. A lot of people thought that it was an anti-war statement. And so Ross Perot, who actually was the Donald Trump of a few years ago, Ross Perot was deeply offended, and he managed to persuade, he's like Donald Trump, quite rich, managed to persuade them to put a representational version in which we have three soldiers standing there. There's one black, one Hispanic, and one white soldier in order to make sure it's perfectly multicultural. And interestingly, after that, women complained there was no women's representation, so a third memorial was built in which they had a woman cradling a man, because women at that time didn't fight, they were mainly nurses and the like. So that's an attempt to society to foster memories of a certain kind. All of these could be considered conversations, in that the conversation, if this is society conversing with you about everybody knows about Lincoln, everybody knows that the Vietnam War, but they're talking about a shared past and trying to structure that shared past. But nations are not the only thing. Oh, sorry. Nations are not the only thing that have collective memories. The Catholic Church has a collective memory. The Orthodox Church has a collective memory. Local towns have a collective memory. You can all tell me something you all know about Cluj. You take every tourist to the Orthodox Church and then the Catholic Church, and you tell little stories about it. So there's this shared representation. Amateur drama clubs, bowling clubs, families, and even couples have collective memories. So collective memories is not just a national phenomenon. But a lot of collective memories are not made through these formal means. They're made through informal means. They're made through everyday conversations. A good example is Lithuania. Lithuania was basically their education was dominated by the Soviet Union up to 1989. And what they learned in school was the Soviet version of history. And in particular, there was a de-emphasis of anything of importance to Lithuania. So afterwards, Schumann and others essentially interviewed people and asked, what do you know about history? What are the important events in history? Now, the Russians actually colonized a good deal of Lithuania, so there was a strong Russian presence in Lithuania. If you were a Lithuanian of Russian descent, you tended to say exactly what you learned in the history books. If you were a Lithuanian of Lithuanian descent, you mentioned events that were important in Lithuanian national history, even though they were not in the textbooks. There were no official societal efforts. Indeed, the societal efforts made sure that you didn't know these things. And the only way you could have done this is through informal conversation. So, especially in cases in which what social scientists call vernacular memory, collective memories, or informal collective memories, everyday conversations with friends and relatives and the like are the ways in which you get this national history. But conversations, especially when you get to a small group, when you get to the bowling club, when you get to a couple, when you get to a family, are almost always exclusively transmitted through conversations. So everyday conversations are very important, and I'm going to focus on everyday conversations. So basically, I've made two observations: that remembering is communicating, often in the form of a conversation, and conversational remembering can promote the formation of collective memories. So I want to make the claim that one consequence of the way memory is designed is that its unreliability and malleability, these design features of memory, allows for the formation of collective memory. And this consequence builds, in fact, on the fact that it's used in this communicative purpose and it has these design features. And the formation of collective memory is useful for human beings, indeed important for human beings, because collective memories bind people together. They essentially promote human sociality, and sociality is an important feature for someone as social as we are. So memory is not just about encoding, storing, and retrieving information. Computer memories may be about this, but in that they are basically storage mechanisms. But human memory seems not well designed as a storage mechanism. So human memory seems better designed to accomplish a social purpose. It's used socially, as noted in the treating memory as communicating, and it's flawed. In particular, it's malleable. That is, it's susceptible to the external influences or social influences, for instance, like what someone says in a conversation. So the malleability of memory may be evolved to accomplish this social function, or humans may use this design feature to accomplish this. I don't know if I can distinguish between those two. But whichever it is, it does seem to, that the malleability of memory could be viewed as adaptive because of its social consequences. Now, I'm going to focus here on conversations, at least I'm going to begin by focusing here on conversations between two people. I somehow have to get this into the lab, and the first way to get this into the lab is to sort of focus on two people talking to each other. And I'm going to focus mainly on two people talking about shared experiences. And the notion is that people may enter a conversation with different memories of a shared experience, and they may leave the conversation with more similar memories, a more developed collective memory, if you like. So the first thing I need to note is that remembering as communicating, that is, conversations are selective in terms of what they remember. People remember some things in a conversation and not others. Beth Marsh, even when she was talking about individual memory, distinguished between recall and retelling. That is, when we remember an event from the past to someone else, we do not tell everything that we could possibly tell. We essentially tailor it to the audience, and she says that we have to distinguish that between retelling from the sort of recall that psychologists usually demand in the lab, where they say, remember everything you possibly can, and please, please do not leave anything out. We leave things out all the time. And that's true even when we get together in a conversation. People do not remember all they're capable of remembering. Nor does the group remember all the group as a sum of the individuals. Remember everything, no, some of the individuals are capable of remembering. It's selective. Some memories go unmentioned, even though the evidence would suggest that they're sitting somewhere in there or capable of being recalled. There are, if you like, mnemonic silences. So as I pointed out, the mentioned material in a conversation probably gets reinforced. Sometimes the unmentioned material, probably because it goes unmentioned, will be forgotten after a while. And sometimes misleading information may be introduced in the conversation, and this can be implanted in other conversational participants' memories. And each of these have the potential to promote a collective memory, in that if something is mentioned, everyone in the conversation is going to get reinforced. If something goes unmentioned, everyone in the conversation is going to experience some sort of collective forgetting. And if you implant memories in everyone, you're going to have this new bit of information. So if you like, what I'm talking about are the microprocesses underlying the formation of collective memory, as opposed to what other social scientists are doing, which are more like macroprocessing. I'm not, as a consequence, focusing on the politics that may lead a conversation in a particular direction. I'm not essentially reformulating that. I'm not asking why a person says what the person says. Nor am I really going to here talk about the way in which shared memories lead to collective identity. I'm really going to focus on just these sort of microprocesses, and in order to move the conversation down even narrowly, I'm going to focus on forgetting. The notion that forgetting can serve a collective purpose has a long, long history. The Romans used to have this practice of dimencio memoriae, in which basically they would decide a person was persona non grata, and they would erase them from everything. All the statues would go down. You weren't allowed to mention this person. They were erased. But we do similar things. If you ask Americans about the foundation of America, they may say Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and forget that the indigenous people were there beforehand. I was shocked to learn that Canadians believe that we invaded them during the War of 1812. We were taught that it was a fight with Britain about maritime issues, but the Canadians think it was an invasion of their country, which is our collective forgetting, I would say. And if you interview people in Belgians, there is a tendency to forget about the brutality, for instance, of Leopold II in the Congo. And I could go on and on. And I want to note that even when recovering a forgotten memory, one is constructing a new collective memory in which there's still selective forgetting. There's always selective forgetting going on somewhere. And there's little doubt that collective forgetting can serve to bind at least the majority of the group, not everyone in the group, but at least the majority of the group together, and therefore promote sociality. And so you can think about a couple. Often it's good for a couple to forget some of the disputes that they've had in the past rather than to dwell on them. It's very socially positive thing to do by and large. Now I want to emphasize, by using the word forgetting, I don't mean that it's erased. I mean it's simply not accessible or harder to access. Couples may not erase their memories of all the difficulties. It just doesn't constantly come to mind to them. And so when I say forgetting, you should keep that in mind. Now, forgetting is often just merely because something goes unmentioned, the memory decays. But I want to really emphasize something else, that's selective remembering. Because you remember some things, it's going to actively promote the forgetting of other things. And this is something referred to as retrieval-induced forgetting. Basically what retrieval-induced indicates that people are more likely to forget unmentioned memories related to what was discussed than unrelated, unmentioned memories. And I'll unpack this in a little more detail by going through sort of the first experimental evidence for retrieval-induced forgetting, which was done by Mike Anderson, Bjork, and Bjork. Basically, what you do is you study word pairs, fruit, apple, fruit, orange, bird, robin, bird, swallow. They're basically category exemplar pairs. And then you are basically given selective practice. So you're asked to recall some information. Then in order to experimentally determine what someone is going to recall, you say fruit, AP, and then they are supposed to say apple. You do not ask them to recall orange. You do not ask them to recall robin. You do not ask them to recall swallow. So it's basically selective recall. And then you ask them, give them a final test where you ask them to remember all the fruit, where you ask them to remember all the birds. And these form three conditions, what's referred to as RP+. RP+ is basically the item which you practice, selectively practiced. RP- is the item which you selectively practice that's related to the item that you actually practiced. And NRP are items which you did not practice but are unrelated to the items that you practiced. Now, if forgetting in this instance, when things go unmentioned, is merely a matter of decay, you should see no difference between RP+ and NRP items. But what you find consistently, I just did this so that, okay. What you find consistently is that you remember the NRP items better than you remember the RP- items. And memorize NRP and RP- because I'm going to use these terms a lot. So it's good to get this in your head right now. And basically what that means is that you essentially are more likely to forget unmentioned items related to the studied items than the unmentioned items unrelated to the studied items. And as I said, it's not simply a matter of decay. This being psychology, there's more than one theory about why this might occur. Probably the most pervasive theory is Mike Anderson's theory, which is an inhibition account. There's nothing that I'm going to say that will depend on what kind of account you adopt to. It's all going to be the same. But in order to motivate why this might occur, I'll tell you about the inhibition account. The inhibition account is basically when you're trying to remember apple, you have to suppress all the competing responses. You have to suppress those competing responses, and so you have to suppress orange, but clearly any of the bird terms, robin and swallow, they're not competing because they have nothing to do with fruits, and you're not going to suppress them. So the suppression lingers, and then when I ask you to recall the animal terms, you have fruit terms, you have trouble recalling orange because it's suppressed. And since you have not as much trouble recalling bird and swallow because it hadn't been suppressed or inhibited. That sort of explains why this phenomenon occurs. So selective remembering induces selective forgetting, if you like. Now, this is pretty much as typical a psychology experiment. You have one person sitting in the lab, studying the material and recalling the material. But I've been talking about conversations. So I need to have more than one person in the lab, and I need to have them conversing with each other. So we've done a variety so basically, if you think about it as a conversation, at any point in the conversation you have a speaker and somebody listening to that speaker. So clearly in the speaker, they're doing exactly what they did in the Anderson experiment. They are retrieving information, and they are consequently remembering, selectively remembering, and you get this retrieval-induced forgetting. What about the speaker? The listener. What about the listener? The listener is merely listening to the person. They don't have to retrieve anything, but you can nevertheless ask, do they show the same pattern? Do they show that NRP is remembered better than RP-? Do you see retrieval-induced forgetting in not just the speaker, in a listener, in a conversation? And so in one experiment, we got two people together to study a story. This is a story about the day in the life of John. John did several things. He went to Coney Island, ate a hot dog, walked on the boardwalk, went swimming. Then he had dinner with Jane, and he helped set the table. He had cocktails, and then he ate a vegetarian meal. So it's basically an episode event structure, which is similar to the category exemplar structure. And then afterwards, these two participants had to get together. They studied the story individually. Then they had to get together and remember the story. And then after they remembered, got conversed, then they were separated, and then they had to remember it individually. So structurally, it's very similar to the Anderson, Bjork, and Bjork experiment, except now it's two people talking to each other. And the question is, do you get retrieval-induced forgetting for both the speaker and the listener? And the poor graduate students had to transcribe these conversations. They were then coded in terms of what was mentioned, what was unmentioned, whether it was related to what was mentioned. And then they basically said, was it mentioned by John or was it mentioned by Harry in the conversation? And that allowed you essentially to end up with an RP minus speaker, RP minus listener, and NRP items. And you can then do the analysis. And what you find is that you get retrieval-induced forgetting both for the speaker and the listener. So basically, they're both forgetting the same sorts of information because of how the conversation unfolds. They end up forgetting information that was unmentioned that's related to how the conversation unfolds. So the conversation structures the remembering in both the speaker and the listener, and therefore promotes a sort of shared representation around, in this case, things that are not mentioned, around these mnemonic silences. And we've looked at this in a wide variety of instances. We've looked at it in stories. We've looked at this in unmentioned material. We've looked at it when the unmentioned material is very memorable as opposed to just a detail. We've looked at it for autobiographical memories, and because NSF wanted me to do this, we looked at this at science material. How long does this last? McLeod and McRae initially said it didn't last for more than 24 hours. There were other reports pointing out that was a week, and there could be several reasons for this discrepancy. It really matters what the interstimulus interval is between the items that you selectively practiced, which is one of the reasons why conversations, I think, are very effective, because there's a very small interstimulus interval, basically none. And the nature of the stimulus material matters. We were interested in trying to boost up, sort of, if you like, the inhibition. And so we contrasted mass versus distributed practice. In every retrieval-induced experiment, retrieval-induced forgetting experiment to date, to this was done, that usually you selectively practice people, but it's always masked. You selectively practice them, then you selectively practice them, you selectively practice them. This is not something we do in everyday life, by and large. Conversations, or if you like, are distributed. So we wanted to, and we know that distributed learning, for instance, it leads to better memory performance, and we wondered whether it could sort of boost up the riff in order to make it more long-lasting. So basically and I should point out that in some of the experiments, the conversations I have are two-way conversations, and in some of them are a one-way conversation. I'm basically having a one-way conversation with you right now. So patients studied material about botany and astronomy. They then saw a video of a lecture. They were told that this was sort of, we were exploring sort of what it was like to learn material through sort of YouTube type medium. There was a masked condition in which they saw the video 3 times in succession, basically. And there was a distributed condition which they saw the video 15 minutes and then 3 to 5 hours afterwards, and then 18 to 22 hours afterwards. And they only saw, importantly, one of these things. So even though they first studied botany and astronomy, they only heard a lecture about botany, so the astronomy served as the NRP condition, and it was all counterbalanced. And 7 days afterwards, we then did their final test. And what you find is you get retrieval-induced forgetting after a week. We also have recently done it for where we had a conversation, more about a story. We did not think that anyone would remember anything about botany and astronomy after a month. And so we then did it after a month, a conversation sort of experiment, and we find retrieval-induced forgetting after, and socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting after a month. So it's a long-lasting phenomenon if under the right circumstances. Now, what does this mean? Practically, what does this mean? So if John wanted his parents to forget that he did poorly on exam, should he avoid talking about his performance on any exam? Or should he talk about how he did on other exams and just fail to mention how the particular exam that he did poorly on? The latter seems to be a better strategy. If George Bush wanted the American public to forget about weapons of mass destruction that figured in his arguments to to enter the Iraq War, should he avoid talking about the build-up to the war? Or should he talk about it, but just avoid mentioning weapons of mass destruction? This suggests that he should talk about the build-up, but not just mention weapons of mass destruction. Similarly, if a wife wants her husband to forget a particularly acrimonious fight they had, should she avoid talking about the fights that they had? Or should she talk about the fights, but avoid talking about this particular acrimonious one? It's clear at this point. She should talk about the fights, but avoid talking about the acrimonious one. Now, what accounts for this socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting phenomenon? My argument is that what happens is that when a listener is listening to a speaker, they concurrently retrieve. So since they concurrently retrieve, albeit covertly, but they're concurrently retrieving. Since they're concurrently retrieving, they're basically doing exactly the same thing that the speaker is doing, and as a consequence, you're going to see this same pattern of retrieval-induced forgetting. Now, at some level, it's amazing that we make this effort. I mean, Danny Kahneman points out that we're extremely lazy creatures. We do as little as we possibly can. Why do we make this cognitive effort? And I would say that it's clear that we do make this cognitive effort, but under what circumstances? What motivates us to make this effort? And I want to concentrate on two motives. One of those motives is an epistemic motive. People need to achieve a valid and reliable understanding of the world. That's one of the things we want. We want a valid and reliable understanding of the world. Thus, they would be motivated to concurrently retrieve when listening to someone tell them something about the world. If they believe the speaker might be conveying something invalid or unreliable, or for some reason what they're getting is not the truth about the world. So if they trust the speaker to remember accurately, there's no need to concurrently retrieve. If they think that what this person is saying is reliable, then they should not concurrently retrieve because it takes a lot of effort, and you shouldn't see socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. On the other hand, if you don't trust the speaker to remember accurately, then they should concurrently retrieve, and you should see socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. So we repeated the astronomy and botany experiment, but now they were told that the person on the video that they were watching lecture selectively about astronomy or botany was a graduate student in astronomy. Let's say the lecture was about astronomy. A graduate student in astronomy. They had had plenty of time to study the material. They were knowledgeable. In the other case, they were told, this is some psychology student that we got to do this. We're just interested in whether you can get novices who don't know diddly squat to come in and do this. And so one case, presumably the person was trustworthy, another case a little less trustworthy. And what you find is when they were warned, I need to push this button. Okay.
Before that one, though.
Yeah. What you find is when they thought it was an expert, you got no socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. When they thought it was a non-expert, you had clear evidence of socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. So what if you basically warn someone that this person is not trustworthy? Now we're going to do sort of the opposite of the kind. That we induce trust, if you like. Now we're going to essentially have a conversation. This is a conversational exchange, and we're going to tell one person in the conversation that other person don't trust their memory. We tested them ahead of time, and they have a lousy memory, and just don't trust their memory. And when they're warned about this, what you find is that you get a lot more socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting when you are warned. You get much less when you're not warned. Suggesting that, again, epistemic motives matter. If you somehow believe that person is not conveying a reliable view of the world, then you are going to make the effort to somehow check them out, to concurrently retrieve. But there's other motives as well. Relational motives, for instance. If you are with your significant other by the fireside talking about your first date, and you are going on and on about the first date, the other person is thinking about the football match that's going to occur that night, that other person is in deep trouble. They are supposed to be concurrently retrieving along with you, and it's supposed to be this shared experience. And if they're thinking about football, just forget it. And so, basically, if you really are interested in forming a relationship with someone, what you're going to do is concurrently retrieve. And one of the ways we check this out, this was done really by Aline Conan, and he was at Princeton at the time, so the participants were Princeton students that read about a study abroad program. And then afterwards they listened to a podcast in which a student who had participated in the study abroad program talked about the study abroad program. It was selective remembering compared to what was on the initial brochure. And then there was a final recall about what you learned from the initial brochure. The question is, does listening to the podcast induce selective forgetting? The manipulation was that they were told the podcast was either a fellow Princeton student or a Yale student, and the relationship between Yale students and Princeton students is mildly acrimonious, and what you found, and the notion was that the Princeton student listening to another Princeton student would be in-group members listening to each other. They would want to form a relationship with each other. In the other case, they were out-group members. They would not want to form a relationship with each other. You should not see socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting when it's to out-group members. You should see socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting when it's to in-group members. And that's exactly... I don't know why this didn't show up. And this is even on my own computer. I'll tell you the results. The results are that basically what I said. You saw socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting when it was to in-group members. You did not see socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting when it was to out-group members. Then Aline did another manipulation, which was he essentially had the participants fill out a questionnaire that emphasized their student membership, that they were students, which essentially emphasized that both the Yaley and the Princetonian were part of the same social group now, that is, being a student. When he sort of shifted them away from thinking of themselves as Princeton and Yale students, but thinking of themselves as part of this larger social group as students, you suddenly saw in the Princeton students retrieval-induced forgetting for both whether it was a Yale speaker on the podcast or a Princeton speaker. So it matters how you primed about what constitutes your group membership, but clearly you're more likely to relate to people if they're in-group members than out-group members, and which would be consistent with this sort of relational motive for promoting retrieval-induced forgetting. Now, one of the things about, if you think about relations, is you have to have somebody to relate to. A lot of our communication, there's not necessarily someone to relate to. When you see a sign on the bathroom door saying, "Do not use, under repair," by and large, you don't really care who the source of that communication is. You just care about the meaning of that communication. And other times, there is clearly a source behind the communication. And we was interested in whether sort of social presence would sort of promote relational motives, which would then lead to retrieval-induced forgetting. And one of the ways we essentially created social presence was to have a picture during the communication. It just so happens, we hadn't noticed till I thought about doing this experiment, that in every single case, we always had a visual representation of the speaker. Either we actually showed them a videotape, actually it was a conversation, someone physically present, and when we had text, we always had a picture of the person that was giving the text. I don't know why we did that, but we did that all the time. And I wondered what happens if you removed the picture. And so that it just was this bland text without any emphasis about who it was that was saying, conveying the information. And indeed, if you look at the sort of computer-mediated communication, they often manipulate social presence by using a picture or not having a picture. And so that's what we did. People read a story, then they heard someone orally present a redacted version of it, then individual recall, and we manipulated social presence by having a picture or not having a picture. And what you find is when there was no picture, there was no socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. When there was a picture, there was socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. And then we wondered, do you always need a visual representation of the communicator in order to get this to happen? So we essentially did a similar experiment, but now there's, the person telling the story either told it in the first person, so it was a story about themselves, or they told it in the third person. It was a story about some anonymous person, John. And what you find is that when it's the first person, you get retrieval-induced forgetting. When it was the third person, you do not get retrieval-induced forgetting. So social presence, how much there is somebody there in the communicative act that you want to relate to, seems to matter a lot. So in a communicative exchange can induce selective and similar forgetting across participants in that exchange, but it mainly does so when there's mistrust of the speaker's mnemonic reliability, not necessarily mistrust of the speaker. When members are within group rather than out group, when speaker has a social presence, that is, there are both epistemic and relational reasons, and probably the dynamics are interactive. They are always present, probably something that would create epistemic motives, other things that are also present that would create relational motives, and how these interact, I haven't the foggiest idea, but it would probably be interesting to explore. Now, there should be a caveat. Concurrent covert retrieval on the part of the listener usually follows what the speaker says. That is, when you're talking to me, I'm concurrently retrieving along with you. And one of the questions that you might ask is, well, why don't you fill in the blanks? Why don't you sort of, if you leave something unmentioned, why don't you just fill in the blanks? Well, my answer to that is it takes a lot of work to fill in the blanks. And especially in a conversation where things are moving along very quickly, you're not going to bother to fill in the blanks, except under certain circumstances. That is, you have to be, just as you have to be motivated to concurrently retrieve, you have to be motivated to make the additional effort to fill in the blanks. And one of the ways in which you might be motivated to fill in the blanks is when your, if you like, when your identity is, especially in this case, your collective identity is threatened in some way, shape, or form. And here we were interested in atrocities and justifications. I had in mind the My Lai instance. My Lai was a massacre that Americans inflicted on the Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War. Some soldiers went into a village and for obscure reasons decided to slaughter everyone in the village. Initially, when it was reported in the press, it was filled with justifications. You know, this explained that, that explained that. But it was further investigated. It just seemed to be just an atrocity. And those justifications sort of dropped out of the discussion, and the concentration was merely on the atrocity. And I wondered how the memory of the justifications lingered. So in this case, participants learned about atrocities and justification of atrocities. There were 4 people. They were committing various atrocities, and there were justifications for each of the atrocities. So what is a sort of category exemplar structure? Then they selected listening to some of the atrocities for some of the people that committed the atrocities, but now they never listened to the justifications. They didn't hear the justifications. And the major manipulation was that the participants were always Americans. But the person committing the atrocity, and this was atrocities committed in the Iraq War, was either an American soldier or an Iraqi soldier. So again, you have this in-group, out-group thing, but you also have an instance in which if in an American, if your identity is threatened, how could a fellow American have done such a horrible thing? There must be a reason. And under that logic, then you will actively work to retrieve the thing which is unmentioned. On the other hand, this Iraqi soldier who cares they're just bad and they commit atrocities, and therefore you won't make that effort. And what you find is that when it was an American, you essentially showed no socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. You essentially actively tried to remember those justifications. When it was a Iraqi soldier, you didn't make the effort, and hence you saw that standard sort of suppression. So selective remembering induces selective forgetting then when a listener does not trust the reliability of a speaker's memory, when the listener mildly disagrees with what the speaker says, when the listener is in the same group as the speaker, when the speaker has a clear social presence, and when the listener's group identity remains unthreatened. So it's not an all or none phenomenon. It occurs, and it occurs in actually just those situations in which you would think would promote social bonding. When you want to relate to somebody, when it is an in-group member, that's when you get it. When it's not an in-group member, that's when you don't get it. When your group identity is threatened, you don't get it. When your group identity isn't threatened, you do get it. Now, I started by saying I was listening to collective memory, and so far I've talked about nothing but dyads, which is sort of as I said, it's a kind of collectivity, but a rather limited kind of collectivity. And I wondered if I could go beyond that. We do know that U does lead to a collective memory in the dyadic studies. If you sort of look at what people remember and what they collectively remember and what they collectively forget, and then combine those scores, or you can look at them separately, it doesn't really matter. You show that increased sort of shared representation after the conversational interaction before, and it can be attributed to both practice effects and induced forgetting effects. But the most simple representation of going beyond two would be something like this, where basically you have a bunch of dyads. You have the politician talking to audience member 1, audience member 2, audience member 3. So it's the most simple sort of extension. And we decided to explore this extension in probably as a realistic domain. And really, since I talked about George Bush and weapons of mass destruction, I thought I would look at political speeches. And in this particular study, we looked at the King of Belgium. And this was not the current king, this was the previous king. Which will turn out to be mildly important, gave a speech in 2012. He delivers 2 speeches every year. And we thought that he might cover 4 issues. For those people that know nothing about Belgium, it has a huge linguistic problem. Half of the country is French-speaking, half of the country is Flemish-speaking. It's much more divided than Romania in terms of Hungarian and Romanian. I mean, they're really divided. And so much so that they could not form a government for 180 days or something. They beat Iraq in terms of being able to form a government. So, that's pretty dysfunctional. Though it was a statement, just as an aside. When I went there when there was no government, all the streets were clean, everything worked just fine, which is an argument why you don't need governments at all. But we anticipated that the king might talk about the language issue, he might talk about the economy was not great then. And the Brussels issue is that Brussels is the only bilingual city in the country. It's also the main economic center. How do you handle that issue? And finally, history. They do not teach history in Belgium. They do not teach Belgian history in Belgium because the Flemish and the French can't get together to figure out how to tell that history, so they decide not to tell the history. So that's an issue. The king delivered the speech. We interviewed people before the speech. We interviewed people after the speech. And luckily, the king only talked about 2 of those 4 issues. So we have some people that listened to the speech, some people that didn't listen to the speech, and within those people that listened to the speech, the king only talked about 2 of the issues. So we can look at whether retrieval-induced forgetting occurs. Here, you see no difference before the speech. What we did was we asked them to list 10 aspects of each of these 4 issues. And we wanted to see whether it was easier to list, nobody could list 10. Easier to list as many as they could. They produced more after the speech than before the speech, or less after the speech than before the speech. No difference in terms of what they could list before the speech. And after the speech, you see, if you listen to the speech, you actually had more trouble remembering things that the king talked about than if you did not listen to the speech. We did not find that for the Flemish, and I think the reason I think the reason why is because the king at that time had very poor Flemish. And they spoke French in their household. They were considered French. They were not considered Flemish. I think that was an outgroup dynamic occurring under those circumstances. So listening to political speech can actually lead to greater forgetting. So don't listen to political speech. This is the moral of the story. For things that was discussed in this, for the topics that were discussed in the speech, but not mentioned in the speech. Recently I've been trying to go, this is still a very sort of simplistic group. You have somebody on the top, and then you have lots of people underneath. But most of our interactions are much more complicated than that. And recently I've been trying, myself and Aline Coman and others, have been trying to sort of go beyond the sort of simple dyadic or hierarchical structure that we had studied and look at more complex structures. We're driven sort of by Dan Sperber's epidemiological model of beliefs, which basically is that you can think of the spreading of a memory like a spreading of a virus. And if you're an epidemiologist, you can ask under what conditions does it easily spread and on what conditions does it not easily spread. I've been talking a lot about those conditions in the terms of what's embodied in each agent in that network that items spread around. But I haven't been talking much about the network structure, which also, if you pick up any book on network theory, will say that it has a huge bearing on how memories spread. So basically, one of the basic questions you would ask is, I've been looking at social interactions between A and B, and any sort of network structure, then B interacts with C. One question you can ask, which is similar to questions that Christakis asked, is does the conversational influence that A have on B propagate to C? Christakis showed that if you're obese, your friend tends to be obese, but your friends of your friend also tends to be obese. So the influence, if you like, propagates, and at one point he has to, he says that there may be 6 degrees of separation, but there's only 3 degrees of influence. We wondered how many degrees of influence there might be. This really, we've been using 3 approaches to sort of ask this question about how things propagate and how much network structure matters. The first is sort of a naturalistic one, and that only gets us so far, but I like naturalistic experiments, so I tried to do this. Basically, we had read a story to one of my classes, and then we interviewed them a week later, then we interviewed them a week after that, and during that week they had to keep track of who they talked to about the story. They weren't required to talk to anyone about the story, but if they talked to about the story, they had to tell us who that person was. And then from that you could build a social network structure, and you could see whether people were directly connected to someone or indirectly connected to someone. And we wanted to know whether you got more convergence, not only among the people that were directly connected to someone in the network, but also for the people that were indirectly, that is, if you had A and C, would A and C's memory tend to converge on the same representation as well as A and B's memory converge. And what we found is that it did indeed propagate. The problem is we can't really say what caused the propagation because they had several conversations in between that. And so it's much harder to sort of track the actual mechanism. Aline has solved this problem by devising a computer network experimental situation in which he basically has people connected through a computer network, and he can basically track each conversation. So you know what A said to B, you know what B said to C, and not only that, you can impose a network structure onto the people, so you can force them to talk to A, and A to talk to B, you can force B to talk to D, etc. So you can essentially make network structures and then trace through how the conversation is exchanging. So you could have a network structure like that. This would be a cluster network in which you have 2 clusters. and you can essentially then have them have, in this case, they had 3 conversational exchanges, and you can see whether or not there's convergence within the network, and B, whether that convergence is due to propagation, that is due not just to the influence of neighbors, but influence beyond those neighbors. And you can then also ask whether the different network structures matter. And he looked at 2 networks, clustered networks and non-clustered networks. What you find is that it does propagate. The degree of separation does matter. That is, how much memories overlap depends on how far away they are. And after about 3 degrees, it begins to get asymptote and it's not very powerful. You can also, this slide is hard to read, but I'll just summarize what it says. It basically asks, is this due to practice? Is any convergence you see due to practice effects, or is it due to also retrieval-induced forgetting effects? And it's due to both of them, basically. So both of the conversational effects I've been talking about leads to convergence with these more complicated networks. Clearly, this is just the beginning, and finally, you looked at 2 network structures, and you got different levels of convergence depending on the network structure. This is a very initial sort of study, but it shows how you can begin to take this sort of basic phenomenon. We started with an individual phenomenon, which is a phenomenon of retrieval-induced forgetting that Mike Anderson talked about. We put it in a fairly simple social context, that is a dyadic exchange. And then we're now moving to much more complicated social networks, which basically will allow us to look at the interaction between the network structure and these sort of more dyadic social exchanges and how those 2 factors interact. The last thing is, the last technique we've looked at is you can do agent-based modeling. This is basically has nothing to do with real people. You write computer programs, you have agents, and agents are connected to each other, and you can essentially put into the agent psychological phenomenon. They are phenomena like practice effects and retrieval-induced forgetting effects, and then you can let the agents talk to each other in prescribed ways. And the initial question that we asked using this, it was simply, does network size matter? Here you have a small world networks, and they can be small or they can be large. And what you find, again, if you have convergence within the network, what you find is you only really get rather rapid convergence when the network is extremely small. And if you sort of think about evolution and adaptation, I'm not going to push this explanation too far, but if you think about it, basically whatever memory mechanisms that we devised and were designed to handle, if it does have this social function, it would be social functions that would work probably in small groups, because that's probably the social organizations in which we lived in a hunter-gatherer society. And you have to do other things like build complex hierarchical structures if you want to create collective memories in larger social structures. So memory is not simply about encoding, storage, and retrieval. It's wrong to think of it simply as a storehouse. It promotes collective, selective forgetting when the speaker and listener are in the same group. When there is some mistrust in the memory of the speaker, it occurs when one mildly disagrees with the speaker's opinion, but not when one strongly disagrees. It depends on the social presence of the source of the communication. It's not present when the identity of the group is threatened. Conversational influences propagate, but only to a minimal degree. And it promotes collective memory in forgetting in small groups, but not in larger groups. More hierarchical structure would probably be needed. So really, human memory is substantially different than computer memory. Memory is not a passive storehouse, as that so many metaphors of memory seem to suggest. If it was simply a passive storehouse, it's deeply flawed. One reason why its perceived flaws may be strengths is that the flaws promote sociality. That is, memory seems to be designed to promote the formation of collective memories. It accomplishes this task because its flaws, not despite of them. And in accomplishing this function, it binds people together, and in so promotes the social nature of human beings, something desirable for us. Thanks. And these are all the people I have to thank, and the National Science Center.